Tonight, we drift back through time itself, past the edges of what we think we know, to a question that has haunted scholars, dreamers, and seekers for generations. The Great Pyramids of Giza stand silent beneath the stars, monuments to a civilization we believe we understand. But what if we don't? What if the oldest written records on Earth, the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, whisper a different story entirely? A story of beings called the Anunnaki, who came from the heavens and shaped the world long before the pharaohs ever rose to power. Tonight, we follow that whisper. Let your eyes grow heavy, let your breathing slow. The ancient past is waiting. Long before the pharaohs raised their monuments along the Nile, long before the great temples of Greece or Rome were even dreamed of, there flowed two rivers through a land that would become the birthplace of everything we recognize as civilization. And these rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, wound their way through what is now modern Iraq, carrying with them the silt and sediment that would make the surrounding plains impossibly fertile, impossibly generous. And it was here, in this crescent of green abundance surrounded by harsh desert, that human beings first gathered in numbers large enough to call themselves a people, first built cities with names that still echo through time, names like Ur and Uruk and Eridu and Nippur, and first began to do something that would change the course of human history forever, something so simple and yet so profound that we still benefit from it every single day of our lives, and that something was writing. The pressing of wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets that would then be baked hard in the sun or in kilns, preserving the thoughts and records and stories of people who lived more than 5,000 years ago. And when you think about it, when you really let that sink in as you settle deeper into comfort tonight, there is something almost miraculous about the fact that we can hear their voices at all. These ancient Sumerians who walked the earth so long ago that the pyramids of Egypt had not yet been built, that the great flood stories had not yet been written down, that the very concept of history itself was still being invented. And yet, here we are, able to read their words, able to understand their concerns about grain shipments and temple offerings and the movements of the stars, able to feel the weight of their fears and hopes and dreams pressing across the millennia like a hand reaching out from the darkness of deep time. And this is possible because clay, unlike papyrus or parchment or paper, does not rot, does not burn easily, does not crumble into dust with the passing of centuries. And so when archaeologists began to dig in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities in the 19th century, they found not just a few scattered fragments, but hundreds of thousands of these tablets, entire libraries worth of human thought and expression, preserved almost perfectly beneath the sand. And the greatest of these discoveries came from the palace of a king named Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Assyrian Empire around 650 BCE, and who was himself fascinated by the ancient past. So fascinated that he sent scribes throughout his realm to collect and copy the oldest texts they could find, gathering them in a great library at Nineveh that would eventually contain more than 30,000 tablets covering everything from astronomy to medicine to mythology, to the everyday business of running an empire. And when this library was discovered in the 1850s by a young Englishman named Austin Henry Layard, it was as if a door had suddenly opened onto a world that had been completely forgotten, a world older than the Bible by more than 1,000 years, older than Homer by even longer, a world where the gods walked among men, and where the secrets of creation itself were recorded in careful cuneiform script for anyone patient enough to learn how to read them. And it is from these tablets and others like them that we know the stories that would shape all the religions and mythologies that came after. The story of a great flood that destroyed the world and was survived by one righteous man in a boat. The story of a garden of paradise where the first humans lived in innocence before being cast out. The story of a tower built to reach the heavens and the confusion of languages that followed. All of these familiar tales appearing first not in the Hebrew scriptures, but in the clay tablets of Sumer and Babylon and Assyria. And among these stories, woven through them like a golden thread, appear the figures known as the Anunnaki, a council of powerful beings who feature in text after text, creation myth after creation myth, and who would become the subject of one of the most fascinating and controversial debates in the study of ancient history. The tablets speak to us across the ages in voices that are at once strange and hauntingly familiar, telling stories of gods and heroes and the origins of all things. And among the greatest of these stories is the Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the oldest work of literature known to humanity, a tale of a king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, who ruled the city of Uruk with a heavy hand until the gods created a wild man named Enkidu to challenge him, and the two became the closest of friends and went on adventures together, slaying monsters and defying the gods themselves, until Enkidu died and Gilgamesh was confronted with the terrible reality of his own mortality, setting out on a quest to find the secret of eternal life that would take him to the edges of the world and beyond. And in this story, we find themes that still resonate with us today. The fear of death, the value of friendship, the question of what makes a life worth living, all wrapped in language that can still move us to tears, 4,000 years after it was first pressed into clay. And alongside Gilgamesh, we find other texts that tell of even older times, the Enuma Elish, which describes the creation of the world through a cosmic battle between the god Marduk and the primordial chaos monster Tiamat, the Atrahasis, which tells of the creation of humanity and the great flood that nearly destroyed us, and numerous other hymns and prayers and administrative records that together paint a picture of a civilization deeply concerned with understanding its place in the cosmos and its relationship to the divine powers that ruled over all. And in these texts, we meet the great gods of Mesopotamia, Anu the Sky Father, who dwelt in the highest heavens and ruled over all the other deities, Enlil, the Lord of the Wind and Breath, who commanded the forces of nature and decided the fates of mortals, Enki, the wise and cunning god of fresh water and wisdom, who often intervened to help humanity when the other gods grew angry, and Ninmah or Ninhursag, the great mother goddess who participated in the creation of humankind and watched over birth and fertility. And beneath these great powers, serving them and carrying out their will, were the Anunnaki, sometimes numbered at 7, sometimes at 50, sometimes at 600, a council or assembly of divine beings whose exact nature and function has been debated by scholars for more than a century. And the truth is that even among experts who have devoted their entire lives to studying these texts, there is disagreement about what the Anunnaki truly were and what role they played in Sumerian religion and cosmology, because the ancient scribes themselves seem to have held different views at different times and in different places. sometimes describing the Anunnaki as the highest gods themselves, sometimes as lesser deities who served the great powers, sometimes as judges of the underworld who decided the fates of the dead. And this ambiguity, this multiplicity of meanings, more is part of what makes these ancient texts so endlessly fascinating and so open to interpretation. For unlike the more systematic theologies that would develop later in human history, Sumerian religion was fluid and evolving, a living tradition that changed and grew over thousands of years, absorbing new ideas and new gods as different cities rose to prominence and different dynasties claimed the favor of different divine patrons. And so when we read these texts today, we must hold our interpretations lightly, recognizing that we are seeing only fragments of a vast and complex tradition that we can never fully recover or understand. The very name Anunnaki has become a source of endless fascination and controversy, for depending on how you break apart the Sumerian words and which linguistic traditions you follow, it can mean different things. With the most commonly accepted scholarly translation being something like princely offspring or children of Anu, referring to their descent from the sky god who ruled the highest heavens. But there are those who have proposed alternative translations that open up entirely different possibilities. Most famously, the late author Zecharia Sitchin, who spent decades studying these ancient texts and came to conclusions that put him at odds with virtually the entire academic establishment. For Sitchin proposed that the name Anunnaki should be translated as those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting not merely divine beings associated with the sky, but actual visitors from another world, beings who descended from the heavens in physical craft and interacted with humanity in ways that were later remembered as mythology, but were actually historical events. And while mainstream scholars have thoroughly rejected this interpretation, pointing out numerous errors in Sitchin's translations and his misunderstanding of Sumerian grammar and vocabulary, his ideas have captured the imagination of millions of people around the world who find in them a compelling alternative to both religious and scientific accounts of human origins. And the question of how we should approach such alternative interpretations is itself worthy of reflection as you rest tonight. For on the one hand, we must respect the careful work of scholars who have devoted their lives to understanding these texts in their original languages and cultural contexts, who have painstakingly compared thousands of tablets and traced the evolution of words and ideas across centuries and civilizations. And, on the other hand, we must acknowledge that our understanding of the ancient world is always incomplete, always filtered through our own assumptions and limitations, and that ideas dismissed as impossible in one generation have sometimes proven true in the next. And so, perhaps the wisest approach is one of humble curiosity, neither accepting extraordinary claims without evidence, nor closing our minds to possibilities that challenge our current understanding, simply allowing the mystery to remain a mystery while we explore the evidence from all sides. And this is the spirit in which we will continue our journey tonight, following the threads of ancient texts and archaeological discoveries wherever they lead, not to prove any particular theory right or wrong, but simply to wonder, to ask questions, to let the strangeness and beauty of the ancient past wash over us like a gentle tide. And as we prepare to leave the rivers of Mesopotamia and turn our gaze toward another great river, the Nile, where even greater monuments would rise from the desert sands, we should remember that these ancient civilizations did not exist in isolation. The traders and travelers and ideas flowed between them along routes of commerce and conquest. That the kings of Egypt knew of the kings of Sumer and Babylon. That stories and symbols, and perhaps even secrets, passed from one great culture to another across the centuries, weaving a web of connection that we are only beginning to understand. And it is along these threads of connection that our story will continue to unfold, gently, slowly, like the turning of stars across the ancient sky. Let us turn now to the Great Plateau of Giza, where the pyramids have stood for so many thousands of years that they have become almost like natural features of the landscape, as eternal and immovable as the hills themselves. And let us begin with what the scholars tell us, with the careful, patient work of generations of Egyptologists who have dedicated their lives to understanding these monuments, for their knowledge deserves our respect and attention before we wander into stranger territories. The conventional timeline, the one you will find in textbooks and museum placards and the lectures of university professors, tells us that the Great Pyramid was built around 2560 BCE during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks later called Cheops, and that it took perhaps 20 years to complete, rising block by block under the blazing Egyptian sun until it stood as the tallest structure on Earth, a title it would hold for nearly 4,000 years, until the spires of medieval cathedrals finally surpassed it. This is not mere speculation or guesswork, for there is genuine evidence to support this dating, evidence that has been gathered through painstaking excavation and careful analysis over more than a century of dedicated archaeological work. In the 1990s, the archaeologist Mark Lehner and his team discovered the workers' village at Giza, a settlement where the pyramid builders lived and ate and slept. And the remains they found there tell us much about who these people were. They were not slaves, as popular imagination long assumed, but rather skilled workers and conscripted laborers from across Egypt, farmers who came during the flood season when the Nile covered their fields and agricultural work was impossible, and they were organized into teams with names we can still read today, names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, the sort of names that working crews throughout history have given themselves, full of camaraderie and rough humor. The bakeries in this village could produce enough bread to feed thousands of workers each day, and the bones found in their refuse heaps show that they ate beef and fish and other foods that suggest they were reasonably well fed, not the starving wretches of Hollywood imagination. The quarries from which the limestone blocks were cut still bear the marks of ancient tools, and the causeways along which the stones were dragged can still be traced across the landscape. And inside the pyramid itself, there are workers' graffiti, marks left by the construction crews in chambers that were sealed away and never meant to be seen again, marks that include the name of Khufu and dates from his reign. The engineering explanations offered by mainstream Egyptology are ingenious and, for the most part, quite convincing, involving ramps of various designs, some straight and some spiraling around the pyramid as it rose, and sledges that could be pulled across sand that had been wetted to reduce friction, a technique that tomb paintings actually depict, and levers and rockers that could inch the massive blocks into their precise positions. The organization required for such an undertaking must have been extraordinary, a logistics operation involving tens of thousands of workers, and the coordination of quarrying and transport and construction and provisioning, all directed by a state apparatus of remarkable sophistication. And the pyramid itself stands as testament, not to supernatural intervention, but to the incredible capabilities of human beings when they are organized and motivated and given sufficient time and resources. The Egyptologists have explained a great deal, and we should honor their work, for they have given us a picture of ancient Egyptian society that is far richer and more nuanced than the fantasies of slaves laboring under the whip. They have shown us a civilization capable of great feats of engineering and organization, and they have demonstrated that human beings, our own ancestors, were capable of creating wonders without any help from the heavens. Let yourself settle into this knowledge for a moment. Let your breathing deepen and appreciate what mainstream archaeology has accomplished, for it has given us a foundation of understanding upon which all further questions must be built. And yet, even as we acknowledge the tremendous achievements of Egyptology, even as we respect the careful scholarship that has illuminated so much about ancient Egypt, we must also be honest about the questions that remain, the puzzles that have not been fully solved, the aspects of these monuments that continue to inspire wonder and even bewilderment among those who study them most closely. The precision of the Great Pyramid is one such puzzle, a precision that seems almost excessive, almost unnecessary for a mere tomb, however grand. The base of the pyramid covers an area of over 13 acres, and yet the difference in level between the highest and lowest corners is less than an inch, a flatness that would be impressive for a modern construction site equipped with laser levels and GPS surveying equipment, but which becomes truly remarkable when we consider that it was achieved 4,500 years ago using tools of copper and stone. The alignment of the pyramid to true north is accurate to within 3/60ths of a degree, which is to say, it is almost perfectly aligned with the rotational axis of the Earth itself. And this precision is difficult to explain using the star sighting methods that Egyptologists propose. Not impossible, certainly, but requiring a level of observational accuracy and mathematical sophistication that we do not typically associate with Bronze Age cultures. The dimensions of the pyramid encode mathematical relationships that have fascinated researchers for centuries, relationships to pi and phi and the golden ratio that some dismiss as coincidence, and others see as evidence of profound mathematical knowledge. If you divide the perimeter of the base by twice the height, you get a number very close to pi. And the relationship between the various dimensions of the pyramid corresponds closely to the golden ratio that appears throughout nature in the spiral of shells and the branching of trees, and the proportions that human beings find most beautiful. Were these relationships intentional, the result of deliberate encoding of mathematical constants, or are they simply the inevitable result of certain practical construction choices, happy accidents that we have invested with meaning after the fact? The honest answer is that we do not know, and those who claim certainty in either direction are perhaps overstating what the evidence allows. The speed of construction presents another puzzle. For if the pyramid was indeed built in 20 years as the conventional timeline suggests, and if it contains roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone, then simple arithmetic tells us that a new block must have been quarried and transported and placed approximately every 5 minutes, day and night, for 2 decades straight, a pace of construction that strains credulity, even accounting for multiple work crews operating simultaneously. Perhaps the timeline was longer than we think, or perhaps there were construction methods we do not fully understand, or perhaps the ancients were simply more capable than we give them credit for. But the mathematics of the undertaking remain challenging to reconcile with our assumptions about ancient capabilities. The granite boxes found in the Serapeum at Saqqara present yet another puzzle. Massive stone containers carved from single blocks of granite with a precision that modern engineers find difficult to explain. The inside surfaces of these boxes are flat to within 2/10,000ths of an inch over their entire length, and the corners are sharp and square in a way that seems to demand machine tools rather than handworking. And yet, these boxes are attributed to the ancient Egyptians, who supposedly had only copper chisels and stone hammers at their disposal. The Sphinx, too, holds its mysteries. For the geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University has argued that the erosion patterns on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure were caused by water, by rainfall, and the last time Egypt received enough rainfall to cause such erosion was before 5000 BCE, perhaps much earlier, which would mean the Sphinx is far older than the conventional dating allows. Older perhaps than Egyptian civilization itself. Not all geologists accept Schoch's analysis. And the debate continues in academic journals. But the question itself is significant, a genuine puzzle that demands explanation rather than dismissal. What is perhaps most curious of all is what we do not have, the records that should exist but apparently do not. For while we have extensive documentation of far more mundane construction projects from ancient Egypt, detailed records of temple building and tomb excavation, we have almost no contemporary documentation of the actual construction of the pyramids themselves, no accounts of how the largest and most impressive structures in the ancient world were actually built. And there is another oddity that deserves mention, which is that the later pyramids, those built by the pharaohs who came after Khufu and Khafra and Menkaure, are generally inferior to the earlier ones, smaller and less precise and more prone to collapse, as if the knowledge or the capability that built the great monuments of Giza was gradually fading rather than accumulating. This is the opposite of what we would expect from normal technological development, where later generations build upon the achievements of their predecessors and create ever more impressive structures. The pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties are not improvements upon those of the 4th. They are diminishments, and this pattern of declining capability is difficult to explain unless we suppose that something was lost, some knowledge or some resource that the earlier builders possessed, but their successors did not. Let these questions settle into your mind gently, not as proofs of anything, not as arguments demanding conclusions, but simply as mysteries worthy of contemplation, as reminders that even our best understanding of the ancient world remains incomplete. There are ancient voices too that speak of origins deeper than we commonly accept, texts and traditions that place the creation of the pyramids and the Sphinx in an age before the pharaohs, in a time when the gods themselves walked upon the earth. The inventory, stela, a limestone tablet discovered near the Great Pyramid in the 19th century, records that Khufu found the Sphinx already standing when he came to Giza, that he came upon this monument to his predecessors and ordered repairs to its damaged portions, which would mean, of course, that the Sphinx was not carved during his reign, as Egyptologists maintain, but existed already, a remnant of some earlier time. Most scholars consider the inventory stela to be a later forgery, created during the 26th dynasty, nearly 2,000 years after Khufu's reign, and they may well be right. But it is interesting that such a tradition existed at all, that Egyptians of later periods believed the monuments of Giza to be older than the 4th dynasty, to which they are officially attributed. The Arab historians who wrote about Egypt in medieval times recorded traditions that attributed the pyramids to a time before the flood, to kings who received warning of the coming deluge and built these structures to preserve their knowledge through the catastrophe. And while we need not take these accounts literally, they do suggest that the great antiquity of the pyramids was a matter of common belief in the cultures that lived in their shadow. The Edfu building texts, inscriptions carved on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, describe a primeval mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time, an island upon which the first temples were built by beings they call the builder gods or the 7 sages. And while Egyptologists interpret these texts mythologically as accounts of cosmic origins rather than historical events, they do preserve a memory or an imagination of construction that predates human civilization as we know it. The concept of Zep-Tepi, the first time, runs throughout Egyptian religious thought, a golden age when the gods ruled directly over Egypt before withdrawing and leaving the land to human pharaohs. And the Egyptians seem to believe that the wisdom of that earlier age was gradually being lost, that their own civilization was a diminishment from a more glorious past, rather than an improvement upon a more primitive one. This is such a different view of history than our own progressive narrative, where things get better over time, and each generation builds upon the achievements of the last. And yet, it is a view that was common throughout the ancient world. This sense of decline from a golden age, this memory or intuition of lost greatness. The flood myths that appear in cultures across the globe, from Sumer to India to the Americas, speak of catastrophes that destroyed earlier civilizations and left only scattered survivors to rebuild. And while skeptics dismiss these as simply the natural result of human settlement near rivers that periodically flood, the universality of these traditions is at least worthy of notice, a pattern that invites contemplation, if not conclusion. The Egyptians themselves, it seems, did not believe they were the first, did not believe their pyramids were the beginning of something, but rather the continuation or the recovery of knowledge far older. And this belief, whether literally true or mythologically significant, colors our understanding of what these monuments meant to those who built them. Let yourself drift with these ancient voices for a moment. These whispers from the deep past that suggest layers of history beneath the history we know, ages forgotten and civilizations lost, and whether they speak literal truth or metaphorical wisdom, they remind us that the past is deeper than we can easily fathom. The connection between Sumer and Egypt, between the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and the Nile, was not a figment of modern imagination, but a reality of the ancient world. For these 2 cradles of civilization were connected by trade routes that carried goods and ideas across the deserts and along the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan found its way to Egyptian tombs, and Egyptian gold flowed eastward to Mesopotamian temples, and along with physical goods, traveled stories and symbols and ways of understanding the world. The similarities between Sumerian and Egyptian iconography have long fascinated scholars. The winged discs that appear in both traditions, the serpent symbolism, the staff of power held by gods and kings alike. And while these parallels can be explained by trade and cultural contact, some researchers have wondered whether they point to something deeper and to a shared source from which both civilizations drew their foundational ideas. The emergence of Egyptian civilization presents its own puzzle, for it appears in the archaeological record with startling suddenness, springing into existence around 3100 BCE, with writing and monumental architecture and sophisticated religious concepts already fully developed, as if it had arrived complete rather than evolved gradually over time. Some scholars see this as evidence of Mesopotamian influence, of ideas flowing westward from Sumer to the Nile Valley, while others propose an earlier indigenous development that simply lacks archaeological visibility. But there are those who wonder whether both civilizations might have inherited their knowledge from a common predecessor, a source culture now lost to history that seeded the great civilizations of the ancient Near East. The mythological parallels are striking when you begin to look for them. For Osiris, the Egyptian god of the underworld and resurrection, shares many characteristics with Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and water, both associated with the civilizing of humanity and the giving of knowledge, and Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, and magic bears resemblance to Ningishzida, the Sumerian deity associated with serpents and secret knowledge, who some alternative researchers identify as the same figure wearing different cultural clothing. Whether these parallels reflect direct borrowing, or common human psychological patterns, or some deeper historical connection, remains an open question. One of those mysteries that invites speculation without demanding conclusions. And it is enough for now simply to note that the ancient world was more connected than our modern divisions of academic study sometimes suggest, that ideas and stories flowed between civilizations in ways we can only partially reconstruct. The theory of a shared source culture, a lost civilization that preceded and influenced both Sumer and Egypt, remains outside mainstream academic acceptance. But it has a certain elegance as an explanation for the parallels and the puzzles we have been contemplating, and it connects to those flood myths and Golden Age traditions that both cultures preserved. Whether such a civilization existed or not, the possibility is worth holding in mind as we continue our exploration, and not as a certainty to be defended, but as a hypothesis to be considered, a lens through which the evidence might be viewed. Let yourself settle into this comfortable uncertainty, this willingness to wonder without demanding answers, for the ancient world keeps its secrets well, and our task tonight is not to solve its mysteries, but simply to dwell within them, to let them wash over us like the gentle waves of a warm sea. And now, as we prepare to go deeper still into the heart of this mystery, as we ready ourselves to explore the claims and theories that venture beyond mainstream acceptance into stranger territories, let us pause for a moment and consider the stars. The ancient Egyptians watched those same stars that shine above us now. It tracked their movements across the heavens with an attention and a precision that we can scarcely imagine in our light-polluted modern world. And the Sumerians too charted the skies with meticulous care, naming the constellations and recording the wanderings of the planets against the fixed background of stars. Both civilizations oriented their most sacred monuments towards celestial bodies, aligned their temples with the rising of particular stars, or the positions of the sun at solstice and equinox, and encoded in their architecture a relationship between heaven and earth that was central to their understanding of of the cosmos. The pyramid shafts that point toward Orion and Sirius. The ziggurats that reach toward the dwelling places of the gods. The careful astronomical observations recorded on clay tablets and temple walls. All speak of cultures for whom the sky was not merely a backdrop to earthly life, but an integral part of it, a realm of gods and ancestors and cosmic forces that shaped human destiny. What did they see when they looked upward, these ancient astronomers? What did they know or believe about the lights that wheeled overhead through the long desert nights? We cannot fully enter their minds, cannot experience the sky as they experienced it, unpolluted by artificial light, undimmed by the assumption that the stars are merely distant suns with no relevance to our daily lives. For them, the sky was alive with meaning, crowded with divine presences, and their monuments were attempts to mirror that celestial realm on earth, to create a correspondence between above and below that would connect human civilization to the cosmic order. As you feel yourself growing more relaxed, more peaceful, more ready for sleep, perhaps you can imagine those ancient skies, the thick river of the Milky Way arching overhead, the planets wandering among the fixed stars, the great constellations rising and setting in their eternal cycles, and somewhere in the darkness the silent monuments standing watch, their stones still warm from the heat of the day, their angles aligned with the turning of the heavens. Whatever secrets they hold, whatever hands shaped them, whatever knowledge they encode, they remain connected to those same stars that shine upon you now, bound to the cosmos in ways we are still trying to understand. In the year 1976, a book appeared on shelves that would forever change the way certain readers looked at the ancient world and at the clay tablets of Mesopotamia in particular. The book was called The 12th Planet, and its author was a man named Zecharia Sitchin, born in the Soviet Union, raised in Palestine, educated in London where he studied economics and history, and eventually settled in New York where he worked as a journalist and shipping executive. Sitchin was not a professional Assyriologist or Sumerologist, but he had taught himself to read cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay by ancient scribes, and he spent decades poring over translations and photographs of tablets housed in museums around the world. What emerged from those decades of study was a radical reinterpretation of Sumerian mythology, one that took the ancient stories not as metaphor or religious imagination, but as literal accounts of events that actually occurred in the distant past. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki were not gods in the spiritual sense, but rather flesh and blood beings who came to Earth from a planet called Nibiru, a massive world that he believed orbits our sun on an elongated elliptical path, swinging through the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years before retreating into the cold darkness beyond Pluto. He proposed that these beings first arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago, drawn here by a specific need, the need for gold, which he suggested they required to suspend in the atmosphere of their homeworld to protect it from degradation. At first, Sitchin wrote, the Anunnaki mined the gold themselves, laboring in the mines of southern Africa, but eventually the work became too burdensome, and so they devised a solution. Using their advanced knowledge of genetics, they took an existing hominid species on Earth, perhaps Homo erectus, and modified its genetic code by splicing it with their own Anunnaki genes, creating a new hybrid worker species. That species, in Sitchin's interpretation, was us, humanity, created not through divine breath or cosmic accident, but through deliberate genetic engineering by visitors from another world. It is an extraordinary claim, and it has been met with extraordinary criticism from scholars who actually specialize in ancient Near Eastern languages. Mainstream Assyriologists have pointed out numerous problems with Sitchin's translations, noting that he often cherry-picked meanings from Sumerian dictionaries while ignoring the grammatical context that determines which meaning is appropriate. That he invented etymologies connecting unrelated words from different language families. That he consistently chose the most exotic possible interpretation when mundane meanings were far more likely. The word Shem, for instance, which Sitchin translated as rocket or sky vehicle, appears in contexts where it clearly means name or renown, as in the famous biblical passage about people making a name for themselves, and scholars argue that Sitchin simply ignored these usages when they contradicted his preferred reading. The planet Nibiru, which Sitchin placed at the center of his cosmology, is indeed mentioned in Babylonian astronomical texts. But in those texts, it appears to refer to Jupiter, or perhaps to a point in the sky associated with the god Marduk, not to an undiscovered planet with an impossible orbit. Astronomers have noted that a planet massive enough to be habitable could not maintain the kind of elongated orbit Sitchin described without either falling into the sun or being ejected from the solar system entirely. And geneticists have found no evidence of the sudden alien genetic intervention that would presumably leave traces in our DNA, though our genome does tell a fascinating story of its own about evolution and migration and the occasional interbreeding with other hominid species like Neanderthals and Denisovans. All of this is worth knowing, worth sitting with, because intellectual honesty requires that we acknowledge when claims rest on shaky foundations. But it is equally worth asking why Sitchin's books sold millions of copies, why they were translated into more than 25 languages, why they continue to inspire readers and researchers and documentary filmmakers decades after their publication. Perhaps it is because the official explanations for human origins and ancient achievements, while well supported by evidence, can feel somehow insufficient, somehow too small for the strangeness of existence. Perhaps it is because the idea that we were created, that we were wanted, that beings from the stars cared enough to bring us into existence speaks to a deep longing in the human heart for significance and connection. Perhaps it is simply because the ancient texts themselves are genuinely strange, full of beings who descend from heaven and ascend again, who live for thousands of years, who possess knowledge and power beyond ordinary human capacity. And Sitchin's interpretation, whatever its flaws, takes that strangeness seriously rather than explaining it away. The wisest approach, perhaps, is neither to accept his translations uncritically, nor to dismiss the underlying questions they raise, but rather to read the primary sources ourselves insofar as we are able, to compare multiple scholarly translations, to hold our conclusions lightly and remain open to revision as new evidence emerges. For that is the way of genuine inquiry, patient and humble, and always willing to be surprised. Now let us turn to what the ancient texts themselves actually say about the Anunnaki and their relationship to the construction of great structures, setting aside for a moment the question of who these beings were and focusing instead on what they were said to have done. The Sumerian mythological texts describe a time before human beings existed, a time when the gods alone walked the earth and performed all the labor necessary to sustain themselves. In the poem known as Enki and the World Order, we read of the god Enki traveling across the land, assigning functions and responsibilities, organizing the cosmos into proper working order, establishing the rivers and the fields and the cities. The Anunnaki are described as a council of great gods, sometimes numbered at 50, sometimes at 7, who decree fate, and beneath them labored a class of lesser divine beings called the Igigi. According to the Atrahasis epic, it was the Igigi who originally did the difficult work of digging canals and maintaining the earth. And it was their rebellion against this labor that prompted the creation of humanity as a replacement workforce. But before humanity was created, the texts suggest the gods themselves built. They constructed temples and cities and sacred precincts. They shaped the world according to their will. Central to Sumerian religion was the concept of the me, a word that does not translate easily into English, but refers to something like divine decrees, or cosmic principles, or cultural institutions, the fundamental patterns and powers that make civilization possible. The me included things like kingship and priesthood, truth and descent into the underworld, the craft of the smith and the art of the scribe, but they also included things like the building of cities and the laying of foundations. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu, where Enki resides, and, through a combination of cunning and intoxication, acquires the Ma from him and brings them back to her own city of Uruk. What interests us here is the implication that the knowledge of building, the principles of construction, were divine gifts, patterns held by the gods and bestowed upon humanity rather than developed independently through human trial and error. The city of Eridu itself, considered by the Sumerians to be the oldest city in the world, the first place where kingship descended from heaven, was associated with Enki and with the Abzu or Apsu, the freshwater abyss that was believed to exist beneath the earth. Enki was the lord of the Abzu, and his temple at Eridu was called the E-Abzu, meaning House of the Abzu or House of the Deep. This subterranean realm was conceived not as a dark and frightening place, but as a source of wisdom and fertility, the sweet waters beneath the ground that fed the rivers and sustained life. Some researchers have drawn parallels between this concept and the subterranean chamber that exists beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza. Carved deep into the bedrock below the structure, its purpose unknown, its rough-hewn walls suggesting perhaps that it was abandoned before completion, or perhaps that its unfinished appearance was intentional. Whether such parallels represent genuine cultural connections, echoes of shared knowledge passed between civilizations, or simply the human tendency to find patterns where none exist, is a question each listener must weigh for themselves. What we can say with confidence is that the Sumerians conceived of their gods as builders, as the original architects of civilization, and that this conception found expression in their temple architecture. In the great ziggurats that rose from the Mesopotamian plain like artificial mountains, their stepped sides ascending toward heaven, their summit shrines serving as meeting places between the divine and human realms. The texts describe the gods laying foundations, molding bricks, raising walls, and while we need not take these descriptions literally, we might at least pause to wonder why the ancients so consistently associated monumental construction with divine rather than human agency. Let us wonder too about the tools and techniques the gods were said to employ, for here we enter territory that has captured the imagination of alternative researchers, perhaps more than any other aspect of ancient mythology. Scattered throughout the world's mythological traditions are references to construction methods that seem to transcend ordinary human capability. The Sumerian texts speak of the gods commanding and things coming into being, of words and utterances that have creative power. The Egyptian tradition describes the god Ptah creating through divine speech, thinking things in his heart and speaking them into existence with his tongue. In the Hindu tradition, the universe itself is said to have emerged from sacred sound, from the primordial vibration of Om. Some researchers have taken these references to sound and vibration seriously, proposing that ancient builders may have possessed acoustic technologies capable of levitating or manipulating heavy stones. Experiments in the modern era have demonstrated that sound waves can indeed levitate small objects through a principle called acoustic levitation, where precisely calibrated sound waves create standing wave patterns with pockets of low pressure that can hold lightweight materials aloft. However, scaling this phenomenon to lift multi-ton stone blocks remains far beyond our current technological capability, and mainstream physicists are skeptical that it was achieved in the ancient past. Others have pointed to the Sumerian word Shem, which Sitchin interpreted as a rocket or flying vehicle, but which appears in contexts suggesting meanings related to name, reputation, or perhaps a monument. The connection to flight comes from passages where the Shem is associated with ascending to heaven. But such ascents could be metaphorical, references to the elevation of status or the journey of the soul after death, rather than literal aerospace travel. We must be careful here, always careful, to distinguish between what the ancient texts actually say and what modern interpreters, ourselves included, want them to say. The texts are genuinely ambiguous, and that ambiguity creates space for multiple readings. But honesty requires that we acknowledge when we are speculating rather than translating. What seems clear across traditions and across millennia is that ancient peoples believed their greatest monuments were connected somehow to beings greater than themselves. Whether we understand those beings as gods, ancestors, extraterrestrials, or symbolic personifications of human potential at its highest expression, the comparative mythologist will note similar themes appearing in traditions that had no known contact with one another. The legends of Atlantis, preserved primarily through Plato but echoing through later traditions, describe a civilization of remarkable technological achievement destroyed by Cataclysm. And some versions of these legends speak of the Tuaui stone, a great crystal that served as a power source and could be attuned through sound to accomplish remarkable feats. The Celtic tradition speaks of the Tuatha De Danann, a race of supernatural beings who came to Ireland bringing 4 magical treasures and who possessed knowledge beyond that of ordinary mortals. The traditions of the Andes speak of Viracocha and his followers, who taught the arts of civilization and who could command stones to move into place. Whether these parallels reflect ancient contact between distant cultures, shared inheritance from a common source, the psychological archetypes common to all human minds, or simple coincidence, is a question we cannot definitively answer from our vantage point, wrapped in the present moment, separated from these events by chasms of time that dwarf our individual lives into insignificance. What we can do, as the night deepens and the ancient world seems to draw closer, is hold these questions with the reverence they deserve. None either grasping too tightly at answers that satisfy our preferences, nor dismissing too quickly the possibilities that unsettle our assumptions. The pyramids stand still beneath the stars, indifferent to our theories, patient with our ignorance, monuments to something certainly, even if we cannot agree on what. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself a kind of gift, an invitation to humility, a reminder that the universe is larger and stranger than any single framework can contain. As we prepare to move deeper into the mystery, to explore the patterns that connect pyramid structures across the globe and the astronomical alignments that bind Earth to heaven, let us carry with us this spirit of openness, this willingness to wonder without demanding resolution. For the questions themselves are ancient, older than Sumer, older perhaps than humanity. The eternal human questions about where we come from, who made us, whether we are alone in the vast and silent cosmos that wheels above us as we drift toward sleep, toward dreams, toward that other kind of knowing that comes when the rational mind releases its grip and allows the deeper currents of consciousness to carry us where they will. And now we widen our gaze, letting it drift beyond the sands of Egypt and the river valleys of Mesopotamia, because the pyramids of Giza do not stand alone in this world. And perhaps that is the strangest part of this story, the part that makes even the most cautious scholars pause and wonder. Across our planet, separated by vast oceans and impassable mountain ranges, cultures that could not possibly have known of each other's existence built pyramidal structures that rise toward the heavens with an almost desperate yearning, as if something deep in the human spirit, or perhaps something whispered into human ears long ago, compelled our ancestors to stack stone upon stone in that distinctive shape, reaching upward, always upward, toward the stars. In the jungles of Mexico and Guatemala, the Maya constructed their stepped pyramids with such precision that twice each year, at the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun casts a serpentine shadow down the staircase of the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, a trick of light and geometry that required not only architectural skill, but profound astronomical knowledge. Knowledge of the exact tilt of the Earth and the precise movements of the sun across the seasons. And we are left to wonder how a civilization without metal tools or wheeled vehicles came to possess such understanding. Further south, in the highlands of Peru, the ancient builders constructed pyramids of adobe brick at Corral, a site now dated to nearly 3000 BCE, making it contemporary with the Egyptian pyramids and raising the uncomfortable question of whether pyramid building somehow emerged simultaneously on opposite sides of the world, connected by nothing we can identify or connected by something we have forgotten. In China, in the Shanxi province, enormous pyramid mounds rise from the landscape, some of them rivaling the Great Pyramid in size. And yet they remain largely unexcavated, unstudied, wrapped in official silence that has fueled decades of speculation about what lies within. And while the simplest explanation is that these are imperial tombs that the Chinese government wishes to preserve undisturbed, the imagination cannot help but wander toward other possibilities, other explanations for why these structures mirror so closely the forms found half a world away. On the island of Java in Indonesia, a site called Gunung Padang has sparked fierce debate among archaeologists because initial surveys suggested that the terraced hill might contain buried structures dating back an almost inconceivable 20,000 years, long before any known civilization. And while many scholars dispute these findings, the controversy itself reveals how unsettled our understanding of the ancient past truly is. How much lies buried not only beneath the earth, but beneath our assumptions about what our ancestors could and could not accomplish. Even in Europe, in the hills of Bosnia, a researcher named Samir Osmanagic has claimed to have discovered pyramids beneath the forested slopes near the town of Visoko, structures he believes predate all known civilizations. And while mainstream archaeology has largely dismissed these claims as misidentified natural formations, visitors continue to flock to the site, drawn by something deeper than evidence, drawn by the possibility that the world is older and stranger than we have been taught. And so, we must ask ourselves what to make of this pattern, this global echo of pyramidal construction. And there are two ways to understand it, each with its own implications, each with its own kind of wonder. On the first is what scientists call convergent evolution, the idea that similar environmental pressures and structural necessities lead to similar solutions, that the pyramid shape is simply the most stable way to build tall with heavy materials, that cultures around the world independently discovered this geometric truth, just as they independently discovered that fire cooks food and sharpened stones cut meat. And there is comfort in this explanation, a reminder that human beings everywhere share the same intelligence, the same capacity for observation and innovation, the same drive to build monuments that outlast their builders. But there is another possibility, isn't there? One that tugs at the edge of thought like a half-remembered dream. The possibility that these scattered pyramids are not independent discoveries, but fragments of a shared inheritance, echoes of knowledge that once spread across the entire world and was then lost, preserved only in these stone monuments and in the myths of gods who descended from the sky to teach humanity the arts of civilization. And while this possibility cannot be proven, neither can it be entirely dismissed, because the patterns are there, undeniable, waiting to be explained. Let us return now to Giza, to the Great Pyramid itself, and consider one of its most puzzling features, one that connects the monuments of Egypt to the stars in ways that still provoke wonder and debate. Within the mass of the Great Pyramid, narrow shafts extend from the inner chambers, angling upward through thousands of tons of stone to emerge on the outer faces. And for many years, these shafts were assumed to be ventilation passages, functional channels designed to bring fresh air to the workers and priests who labored in the pyramid's depths. But careful measurement revealed something far more intriguing, something that transforms these simple passages into fingers pointing towards specific points in the ancient sky. The southern shaft of the king's chamber, when traced upward at its precise angle, aimed directly at the star Al-Nitak in the constellation we call Orion. And the southern shaft of the queen's chamber pointed towards Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, sacred to the Egyptians as the embodiment of Isis. And suddenly these were not ventilation shafts at all, but astronomical instruments. The stone telescopes built into the very fabric of the pyramid, aligning the buried pharaoh with the cosmic powers that would guide his soul to the afterlife. It was a Belgian engineer named Robert Bouval who took this observation further in the 1990s, proposing what he called the Orion correlation theory. The idea that the three pyramids of Giza were deliberately positioned to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt. That the entire plateau was a map of heaven, rendered in stone. As above, so below, the ancient Hermetic principle made manifest in limestone and granite. And when Beauval used astronomical software to calculate when the shafts would have aligned most perfectly with their target stars, accounting for the slow wobble of Earth's axis that astronomers call precession, he found that the alignment pointed not to 2500 BCE, the accepted date of construction, but to approximately 10,500 BCE, 12,000 years ago, a time when conventional history tells us humans were simple hunter-gatherers, incapable of building anything more sophisticated than temporary shelters, and yet a time that appears again and again in ancient myths as the age of the gods, the first time, the era when divine beings walked the earth and established the foundations of civilization. We must be careful here, as we must be careful throughout this journey, not to mistake intriguing possibilities for proven facts. And many astronomers have criticized Beauval's methodology, pointing out that the correlation is imperfect, that the pyramids do not quite match the stars. Now that precession calculations can be made to support almost any date if one is selective enough about which alignments to emphasize. And these criticisms deserve our respect, our thoughtful consideration. But the deeper truth remains. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with Orion, with the stars of that constellation that they associated with Osiris, lord of the underworld and judge of the dead. And the Sumerians shared this obsession, calling the same star pattern the true shepherd of Anu, the celestial guide who watched over the heavens on behalf of the king of the gods. Two civilizations, two mythologies, one region of the sky, and perhaps this is coincidence. Perhaps Orion's distinctive shape naturally draws the human eye and imagination. But perhaps it is something more, a shared inheritance, a common teaching, a finger pointing toward the place in the cosmos from which, according to the ancient texts, the gods themselves descended. And now we come to the flood, that great catastrophe that echoes through the mythologies of cultures around the world, from the biblical story of Noah to the Greek tale of Deucalion to the Hindu account of Manu, all of them telling essentially the same story of divine warning, of one righteous person chosen to survive, of a vessel that rides out the deluge while the rest of humanity perishes, of a new beginning on a world washed clean by the waters of destruction. But the oldest version of this story, the earliest flood narrative we possess in written form, comes from Sumer, inscribed on clay tablets centuries before the Hebrew Bible was composed, and it tells of a king named Ziusudra, or, in later Babylonian versions, Utnapishtim, who was warned by the god Enki that the divine council had decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. And Enki, always the friend of humans, whispered through the wall of Ziusudra's reed house, telling him to build a boat and fill it with the seed of all living things. And so humanity survived the wrath of the gods, not through our own merit, but through the compassion of one divine being who could not bear to see his creation utterly destroyed. This is not merely a charming myth, a quaint story from a vanished civilization, because in recent decades, scientists have begun to take seriously the possibility that a catastrophic flood event, or series of events, actually occurred at the end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, when the massive glaciers that covered much of North America and Europe melted with surprising rapidity, sending walls of water cascading across the continents, raising sea levels by hundreds of feet, drowning coastlines where early human settlements would naturally have clustered, and perhaps drowning as well whatever civilizations had developed there during the long millennia of the Ice Age. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that this melting may have been triggered or accelerated by a comet or asteroid impact, fragments of cosmic debris striking the ice sheets and causing sudden, catastrophic melting. And while this hypothesis remains controversial, the geological evidence for rapid, dramatic climate change at the end of the Pleistocene is undeniable. A planetary trauma that would have seemed to any humans who survived it, and like the end of the world, like the wrath of the gods made manifest in rising waters and vanishing coastlines. And if civilizations existed before this catastrophe, civilizations we know nothing about, because their coastal cities now lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, then the myths begin to make a different kind of sense, not as primitive fantasies, but as traumatic memories, encoded in story and passed down through countless generations. Memories of a time before the flood when the gods walked among us, when great structures rose toward the sky, when knowledge flowed freely from heaven to earth, all of it washed away in the deluge, preserved only in fragments, in the great pyramids that somehow survived, in the ancient texts that speak of builders from the sky, or in the persistent human intuition that we have forgotten something important about our own past. Perhaps Egypt and Sumer were not the birthplaces of civilization, but its refuges, places where survivors gathered to rebuild, carrying with them what fragments of the old knowledge they had managed to preserve, constructing new pyramids in imitation of older ones, now lost beneath the waves, worshipping gods who were memories of teachers who had come before the flood to share their wisdom with humanity. This would explain so much that otherwise puzzles us. The sudden appearance of sophisticated civilization in these regions, the advanced astronomical knowledge, the construction techniques that seem beyond the capabilities of early Copper Age societies, the persistent myths of a golden age destroyed by water. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the conventional timeline is correct, and human ingenuity alone accounts for all that we see at Giza, and the flood myths are nothing more than exaggerations of local river flooding, and the global pattern of pyramids is indeed convergent evolution, independent cultures reaching the same architectural conclusions for purely practical reasons. We cannot know for certain, and perhaps we never will, and there is a certain peace in that uncertainty, a freedom from the need to choose one story and reject all others. The geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx enclosure and found patterns of erosion that he believes could only have been caused by prolonged rainfall. Rainfall that has not fallen in sufficient quantities on the Giza Plateau for thousands of years, perhaps since before 5000 BCE, perhaps since the end of the last ice age. And if the Sphinx is that old, then everything we think we know about Egyptian chronology must be reconsidered, every assumption questioned, every certainty dissolved back into mystery. His colleagues largely reject this conclusion, pointing to other possible explanations for the erosion patterns, and the debate continues, as debates should continue, because that is how knowledge grows, through questioning and testing and refusing to accept any answer as final. And so, here we rest for a moment, suspended between stories, between the conventional history that appears in textbooks and the alternative possibilities that haunt the edges of that history, like dreams half remembered upon waking. We have traveled far tonight, from the ziggurat temples of ancient Sumer to the limestone passages of the Great Pyramid, from the clay tablets that speak of gods descending from heaven to the star shafts that point toward Orion, from the flood that may have destroyed an earlier world to the monuments that may have survived it. And we have found no final answers, because final answers do not exist. Not really, not in the study of the ancient past, where so much has been lost to time, and where every conclusion rests on interpretation, on assumptions, on the limits of what we can imagine our ancestors accomplishing. Perhaps the Anunnaki were gods of myth, personifications of natural forces, nothing more. Perhaps they were memories of an earlier human civilization, advanced in ways we cannot fathom, whose survivors became the teachers of later cultures. Perhaps. And here we must tread most carefully, because we touch the realm of pure speculation. Perhaps they were something else entirely, visitors from beyond our world who left their mark on human mythology and human monuments before departing for destinations we cannot imagine. We do not have to choose tonight. We do not have to decide which story is true and which is fantasy. It is enough to wonder, enough to let the questions wash over us like gentle waves, like the waters of the ancient flood receding to reveal a new world waiting to be explored. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, and humanity is ingenious at solving them. But other mysteries are meant to be inhabited, to be dwelt in, to be savored like fine wine. And the mystery of the pyramids, the paradox of the Anunnaki, belongs perhaps to this second category, a mystery that enriches our lives not by its resolution, but by its persistence, by the way it reminds us that the universe is vast and old and full of wonders we have not yet discovered, may never fully discover, and that this is not a tragedy, but a gift. Let your thoughts drift now toward sleep, toward the deep rest that awaits you, knowing that the pyramids will still be there tomorrow, still keeping their secrets, still rising toward the stars that have watched over them for thousands upon thousands of years. The questions will wait, the mysteries will keep. For now, it is enough to have wondered, and to let that wondering carry you gently, peacefully into dreams. And so we arrive at last at the place where all journeys through ancient mysteries must eventually lead. That quiet clearing in the forest of speculation where we sit down and take stock of what we have gathered along the way, and perhaps more importantly, what we must humbly admit we have not found. For the truth of the pyramids, like the truth of so many ancient wonders, does not yield itself easily to those who seek it. And after all these centuries of inquiry, after all the excavations and translations and measurements and theories, we find ourselves still holding questions in our hands like smooth stones pulled from a riverbed, beautiful and solid and real, yet ultimately mysterious in their origins. And this is not a failure of scholarship or imagination, but rather an honest accounting of where human knowledge meets its boundaries. For we do know certain things with reasonable confidence. We know that the Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite. We know that its base covers 13 acres and that its original height reached nearly 481 feet toward the heavens. We know that workers' villages existed nearby, and that copper tools and wooden sledges were among the instruments of its creation. We know that the pharaoh Khufu ruled during the 4th dynasty, and that ancient Egyptian society possessed remarkable organizational capabilities. And these facts form a foundation upon which mainstream Egyptology has built careful and considered explanations for how such monuments might have risen from human hands and human will. And we should honor this work, for archaeology at its best represents one of humanity's noblest endeavors. The patient sifting through sand and rubble and time itself to recover the voices of those who came before us. The peer review process that challenges claims and demands evidence. The slow accumulation of knowledge across generations of dedicated scholars. This is how we have learned most of what we know about the ancient world, and it deserves our respect and gratitude. Yet, intellectual honesty also requires us to acknowledge what remains unexplained. The precision of the cardinal alignments, the mathematical relationships embedded in the structure, the sheer speed of construction implied by the conventional timeline. The curious fact that later pyramids were built with less skill rather than more. The water-weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure that some geologists believe point to a much earlier date. These are not invented mysteries, but genuine puzzles that continue to resist easy resolution. And here, we must also turn our careful attention to the alternative theories we have explored tonight. The Sumerian tablets and their stories of the Anunnaki, the translations of Zechariah Sitchin and those who followed him, the suggestions of ancient astronauts and lost civilizations and technologies beyond our current understanding. And we must acknowledge that these theories too have their difficulties, that Sitchin's translations have been challenged by scholars of ancient Semitic languages, that the leap from mythology to literal history requires evidence that has not been definitively provided, that extraordinary claims do indeed require extraordinary proof. And we do not serve the truth by ignoring these problems any more than we serve it by dismissing the genuine mysteries that inspired these theories in the first place for the wisest position, the one that honors both the achievements of scholarship and the enduring strangeness of these ancient monuments, is one of intellectual humility, a willingness to say we do not know while remaining genuinely curious about what we might yet discover. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson the pyramids offer us, not an answer, but an invitation to hold our certainties more lightly, to remember that every impossible claim in history was once considered fringe, before evidence transformed it into accepted fact, that continental drift was mocked before it became plate tectonics, that the existence of Troy was dismissed as myth before Heinrich Schliemann's excavations, that the very idea of deep time, of a world millions and billions of years old, was once heresy against established belief. This does not mean that every fringe theory will prove correct, far from it. But it does suggest that the boundaries of accepted knowledge are more permeable than we sometimes assume, and that genuine mysteries deserve genuine openness rather than reflexive dismissal. And now let us turn from what we know and do not know to the deeper question of what it means that we keep asking these questions at all. For there is something profound in the persistence of pyramid mysteries, something that speaks to fundamental human needs that transcend any particular theory or explanation. We are creatures who hunger for origin stories, who feel the weight of our existence and seek to understand where we came from and why we are here. And the pyramids, standing at the dawn of recorded history, serve as a kind of mirror in which we see reflected our own assumptions about human capability and human meaning. If the conventional explanations are correct, then the pyramids stand as testament to what ordinary human beings can achieve through organization and determination and collective will. They tell us that our ancestors were not primitive or limited, but possessed capabilities that we have perhaps underestimated. That human ingenuity, when properly directed, can move mountains and touch the stars. And this is a beautiful and inspiring story, one that affirms human potential and reminds us that greatness lies within our reach. But if the alternative theories contain some grain of truth, if the pyramids are older than we believe, or were built with knowledge we have lost or assistance we have forgotten, then they tell a different story, one in which human history is longer and stranger than we imagine, in which we are perhaps not alone in the cosmos, in which there are chapters of our past still waiting to be discovered and understood. And this too is a beautiful story, one that expands our sense of possibility and invites us to dream larger dreams about our place in the universe. And here is the secret that the pyramids whisper to those who listen with patient hearts. It does not finally matter which story is true. What matters is that we stand before these monuments and feel something stir within us. Wonder perhaps, or awe, or that peculiar vertigo that comes from contemplating deep time and vast achievement. The pyramids connect us to our ancestors across the chasm of millennia. They remind us that we are part of a long story still being written, that others came before us and asked the same questions we ask, and gazed at the same stars we gaze upon, and whether those ancestors were aided by gods or visitors, or were simply more capable than we give them credit for. They left us these monuments as a gift, a challenge, a question mark carved in stone and stretching toward heaven. And perhaps the greatest wisdom is to receive this gift with gratitude, to let the mystery remain a mystery, to find peace in not knowing while never ceasing to wonder. For the questions themselves have value beyond any answers we might discover. They keep us humble before the vastness of history. They remind us that knowledge is always provisional and that reality is always larger than our models of it. They connect us to the countless generations of humans who have stood where we now stand, in imagination at least, looking up at these impossible monuments and asking how and why and who. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the pyramids rest gently in your mind, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a companion to your dreams. Let them stand in that interior landscape as they stand in the desert, patient and silent and enduring, asking nothing of you except your wonder, offering nothing except the reminder that the world is more mysterious and more beautiful than we sometimes remember, and that mystery itself is a kind of gift, an invitation to remain curious, to keep questioning, to hold our certainties lightly and our wonder close. The pyramids will be there tomorrow and the day after, and for thousands of years to come. They will watch the sun rise over the desert and the stars wheel overhead, just as they have for ages beyond counting, and they will keep their secrets or yield them up in time. But either way, they will endure, monuments to ambition and skill, and perhaps to contact with forces beyond our understanding, or perhaps simply to the extraordinary capabilities of human beings working together toward a vision larger than themselves. And both possibilities are wondrous. Both deserve our contemplation and our respect, and both can accompany you now as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing deepens ancient world recedes into the soft darkness of approaching sleep, where perhaps the pyramids will appear in your dreams, golden in the light of a setting sun, whispering their secrets in a language just beyond understanding, inviting you to wonder, always to wonder. And now, as our journey through the ancient world draws softly to its close, let us return one final time to that eternal image of the pyramids, standing silent beneath the vast canopy of night, where the same stars that shine down upon you tonight once cast their gentle light upon the builders, whoever they may have been, and upon the Sumerian scribes who pressed their reed styluses into wet clay, and upon every generation of dreamers and wanderers who have gazed upward and asked the same questions we have been asking together. And there is something deeply comforting in that continuity. Is there not that the night sky connects us across all the centuries and all the miles to those ancient souls who also lay down after long days and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead and let their minds drift towards sleep, just as you are doing now? And the mysteries we have explored tonight will still be there in the morning, waiting patiently as they have waited for thousands of years, because the pyramids are patient and the desert is patient. And the old questions about who we are and where we came from do not demand immediate answers. They simply invite us to wonder, and wondering is a gift we give ourselves. So let your breathing grow slower now and deeper, and feel how your body has grown heavy and warm and comfortable, and know that you are part of something vast and ancient, a great lineage of human beings, stretching back through time, who have looked at the monuments of the past and felt that same stirring of awe and curiosity. And know too that it is perfectly all right to let these thoughts grow soft around the edges, now to let them blur and fade like distant firelight, because sleep is a calling to you, and sleep is good and natural, and you have earned this rest. And as you drift away, imagine, if you will, the cool night air of the desert and the limestone glowing faintly under starlight, and the perfect silence that has held that sacred place for millennia, and let that silence hold you too. Let it wrap around you like a blanket and carry you gently down into dreams, where perhaps the ancients themselves will meet you and share their secrets in the language that needs no words. And until we meet again on another night for another journey into history, may your sleep be deep and peaceful and restorative, and may you wake refreshed and ready to wonder anew at this strange and beautiful world we share. Good night, dear friend. Good night.